Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig. It's been 1 year since the mass uprising in Egypt, which resulted in the overthrow of President Hosni Mubarak. Since then, the country's been ruled by an interim military government, and recent parliamentary elections resulted in the Freedom and Justice Party of the Muslim Brotherhood, an Islamist party, winning the greatest number of seats. But a transition from military to civilian rule has yet to take place, and demonstrators have, once again, gathered in Tahrir Square, demanding a handover of power. So, 1 year on, has Egypt's revolution stalled, and are human and economic rights being respected, and what's the situation like on the ground for aid and development work? To discuss Egypt's revolution 1 year on, I'm joined in the studio here in London by Karl Sharro, who's a Middle East commentator, the journalist Nabila Ramdani, Oliver Pearce, who's Christian Aid's Middle East Policy Officer, and on the line from Cairo by the journalist and writer Nawal El Saadawi. Nawal El Saadawi, let me come to you first. 1 year on from the overthrow of Mubarak, things are still looking quite uncertain. What's your overall assessment of where we are?
I can say from the demonstrations, the millions of men and women and children from all sectors of Egypt going to squares and streets from Aswan to Alexandria and Suez. All those millions now remind us of the 25th January last year when we were able to remove Mubarak. So now we want to remove the military, the High Council of the military, to start to have a new constitution, to realize, to have a fair trial, because the trial of Mubarak is ridiculous, is really fake. So we need a real trial for Mubarak and for the people who corrupted the country. And we need a constitution based on justice, dignity, and freedom for all, regardless of religion or gender or class or anything.
I want to talk more about a lot of the points that you raise in detail in a moment, but we might be having a second revolution taking place.
Well, some people say it is the same revolution but a second wave. We can say first wave last year, this is the second wave. And in fact, the name is not important. The essential point is what we need, what we can achieve, whether we really, because we succeeded last year in removing the head of the regime, the head of the corrupt regime, Mubarak, but the whole regime, the body of the regime, still there in the High Council of the military, in the media, in the government, everywhere.
Nabila Ramdani, 1 year on, are things still looking uncertain?
Well, as Nawal, made it abundantly clear, I think this is an ongoing revolution which is taking place at multiple levels. And I think the main worry is now the ever-present might of the Egyptian military that is still controlling the country. And when you look at Egyptian youths on the news, they're telling you that there's been no improvement so far. So the military are still ever present, and the worry is that the economic condition of Egypt is very much a problem at the moment. And the military actually controls between 10 to 40% of the economy, and that's something that's very much on the minds of the Egyptian people who would like to have a share in the economy of the country and prevent the military forces to preserve the economic interests in the country.
The military council who are governing the country at the moment say that, simply put, they need more time. Do you have any sympathy with that argument at all? Does post-Mubarak Egypt need a bit more time before we see this kind of transition?
I do not believe so. We've seen how the Egyptians were extremely efficient at mobilizing themselves. They made, considerable work so far, And what they would like to avoid is to see a repeat of history where the military in Egypt has been the backbone of Egyptian politics ever since the fall of the monarchy in 1952, and ever since every president which emerged has emerged from the top military ranks, and that's precisely what they would like to avoid in the future.
Karl, Sharro, let me bring you in here. I mean, are we looking at a situation which is still inherently unstable? Or, I mean, we have seen elections in Egypt. There is clearly a process in place. Are things still as really uncertain as they seem?
They are quite uncertain, and I think we need to understand the structural reasons for that, because I don't want to sound to be pessimistic or cynical about the revolutionary dynamic here, because we've seen some amazing feats of courage and organization. But essentially what we were witnessing across the board in Arab countries is a vacuum that was left by the collapse of long-standing regimes that are completely delegitimized by now, because they have failed to deliver on all their promises on the developmental front, on the democratic front. And that kind of void is inviting other players and popular groups and parties to come in and fill it. And what we're seeing at the moment is this competition between various incoherent narratives that are trying to fill that void and write the future of Egypt. Now, there's a big stumbling block in the way, which is what was very frequently celebrated about the Arab uprisings in general and also Egypt, is the lack of a clear ideological framework and the non-political, apolitical nature of it to a certain extent. That, to my mind, is actually an obstacle, because it's preventing the majority of Egyptians from joining in with a very clear path for change, a more radical one. And it was translated in the victory for the forces that were already present on the ground, which is broadly the Islamists and the biggest winner, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood, that to a large extent are socially conservative forces that don't like to see a prolonged state of anxiety or disorder. So their interest is bringing in Egypt to a more kind of stable, even if not very democratic state in Egypt. And that's a big challenge. Now, what that means is the more secular and liberal and leftist forces in Egypt will need to organize and come up with a very clear plan and a vision for the future of Egypt, for this dynamic to shift. And if that doesn't happen, I'm afraid we're looking at a protracted period of slow change and might end up kind of absorbing some of that energy that was released last year.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig, and today I'm discussing the situation in Egypt 1 year after the fall of Mubarak with my guests Karl Sharro, Nabila Ramdani, Oliver Pearce and Nawal El Saadawi. I do want to come on to talking about the elections and the implications of the results of those elections in a moment. But first, Oliver Pearce, let me just ask you the situation on the ground in terms of aid and development work in the post-Mubarak year. What is that situation like? What's been the experience of your organisation?
Well, as my colleagues have alluded to, the economic situation in Egypt has, if anything, in the past year deteriorated for many Egyptians. There has been rising unemployment, some of that due to reduced demand in the economy within Egypt, and also returning migrant workers coming from countries such as Libya, where previously over 1 million Egyptians were thought to have worked and sent money home to families. When you put those kinds of groups together, you find that in a number of communities there are many families who no longer have a breadwinner in their home, and as a result of that, there's high unemployment and people can't afford basic services. As a result of that, Christian Aid, working with our local partner organisations, established an emergency programme to try and support, using a cash for work approach, a number of those communities most badly affected by the rising unemployment and by that inability to pay for basic goods on the part of many families across the country.
Nawal El Saadawi, the recent parliamentary elections have resulted in the Muslim Brotherhood winning more seats than anyone else. What is your assessment of that? Do you have any concerns about the Muslim Brotherhood or a government led by the Muslim Brotherhood?
I disagree totally with the people that say that our elections in Egypt was democratic and free and honest. It was not. It was pre-planned. The power of the high military council with the Muslim Brothers, with the United States. All those, Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the very conservative powers inside the country and outside, the capitalist, patriarchal powers, they collaborated together to bring the Muslim Brothers because they are really afraid of the radical change, radical economic change in the country. In fact, there is a lot of money inside Egypt. Now we are reading about millions of dollars in the central bank in Egypt owned by Mubarak, and millions of a lot of money of the business people and Mubarak family everywhere outside the country and inside the country. And even some writers are saying, we are borrowing, we are begging for 3 million from the IMF, with such a high interest, while we have the money here. So really, the capitalist, conservative, military, colonial powers, with the military, with the Muslim Brothers and religious groups, they planned all that to prevent the real radical revolution in Egypt. They are leading this country to more conservative, patriarchal, capitalist submission to the U.S. They are not resisting at all. They are negotiating with Hillary Clinton and Obama and Americans. They have no radical views in the economy or social life or anything. They say only Islam is the solution. They don't have a program. They just need power.
Nabila, Ramdani, let me come to you on this question of the Muslim Brotherhood. If they've won the majority of seats in the Egyptian parliament, then surely that indicates that they are reflective of what the majority view is in Egypt.
Well, I understand Nawal's concerns about perhaps the context in which the elections took place, which perhaps were not very transparent. Having said that, I think the success of the Muslim Brotherhood is very much consistent and indeed in line with the rise of political Islam in neighboring countries, such as in Tunisia, but also in Morocco. And in Jordan, elections are coming up in late February, and the Muslim Brothers in Jordan are also said to be doing pretty well. And this has, very solid explanations. First of all, we are talking about Muslim-majority countries, so it shouldn't be surprising to see Muslim parties being successful in that context. Second of all, these are the very parties which took up the role of the state during the years of dictatorships, which have been providing, social justice. And they have, put forward not a religious agenda, but an anti-corruption agenda, which is very much what the Arab Spring is all about. And third of all, and perhaps more crucially, we have seen how dictators were working hand in hand with Western governments, including the American administration, on the so-called war on terror, which tarnished Islam as a religion as a whole and demonized Islamic parties. The Muslim Brotherhood was banned until this year in Egypt. So this made them even more popular at home. Now, these elections are very much a test for the Muslim Brothers. They will have to formulate a new constitution, and we'll have to see what they do with that. And more crucially, if they fail to deliver on such things like social provision, health reforms, and indeed infrastructure projects, then they could possibly be more mobilization on Egyptian streets.
Karl, Sharro, on the question of the elections and the new government, or what we assume will be a new government based on those results, how confident are you that a new government, a civilian government, can come to power and start to get to grips in an inclusive way that sort of brings the entire country along with it?
Not at all, to be honest. I think the process, if the revolutionary process of change stalls now, and there are indication that might happen, I think we'll see a period in which, unlike what Dr. El Saadawi was kind of insinuating, that there is some kind of grand plan behind the scenes. In fact, there isn't. And the Muslim Brotherhood found themselves winning the election as a matter of fact, as a kind of the de facto organized power on the ground. But very crucially, and if you look at the behavior of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamic party, Islamist parties in Tunisia and Morocco and other places, they're actually quite reluctant to grab power on their own. That's because there is no clear project for governance. There are policies that were designed and attitudes that were designed to kind of protect a certain Islamically tinted civil society.
When we were able to remove Mubarak, so now we want to remove the military, the High Council of the military, to start to have a new constitution, to realize, to have a fair trial, because the trial of Mubarak is ridiculous, is really fake. So we need...
I'm joined in the studio here in London by Karl Sharro, who's a Middle East commentator, the journalist Nabila Ramdani, Oliver Pearce, who's Christian Aid's Middle East policy officer, and on the line from Cairo by the journalist and writer Nawal El Saadawi. Nawal El Saadawi, let me come to you first. 1 year on from the overthrow of Mubarak, things are still looking quite uncertain. What's your overall assessment? But a transition from military to civilian rule has yet to take place, and demonstrators have once again gathered in Tahrir Square demanding a handover of power. So, 1 year on, has Egypt's revolution stalled, and are human and economic rights being respected, and what's the situation like on the ground for aid and development work? To discuss Egypt's revolution 1 year on, of where we are.
I can say from the demonstrations, the millions of men and women and children from all sectors of Egypt going to squares and streets from Aswan to Alexandria and Suez, all those millions now remind us of the 25th January last year.
Welcome back. You are listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig. It's been 1 year since the mass uprising in Egypt, which resulted in the overthrow of President Hosni Mubarak. Since then, the country's been ruled by an interim military government, and recent parliamentary elections resulted in the Freedom and Justice Party of the Muslim Brotherhood, an Islamist party, winning the greatest number of seats.